Historians have always had trouble with the topic of George Washington and slavery. When he died in 1799, there were over 300 slaves working at Mount Vernon. Now, some people say George Washington was a stern master, as you might expect of a military man. And others say, oh, no, he was very kind and generous and far more liberal than his neighbors. Well, we may never know exactly what George Washington thought about slavery, but we do know what at least two of George Washington's slaves thought about being owned by George Washington. They ran away and they never came back. Now, one of these slaves was called Henry Washington, and his real name is unknown. And he was born in 1740 along the Gambia River in Africa. And as a young man in his 20s, he was sold into slavery, and he subsequently became the property of George Washington. And he became a groom at the stables at Mount Vernon. Well, as we all know, in 1775, the American colonies revolted against Great Britain. And you had the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and there were a number of smaller battles here in Virginia. Well, in November 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation, and he said, any slave who runs away from his master and joins the British Army will become free. So hundreds of slaves began to leave their plantations and head for the British lines. And one of these was Henry Washington. He made his way to Norfolk, and he joined Lord Dunmore's forces in an outfit called the Ethiopian Regiment. And this was a unit made up entirely of blacks, 400 fighting men. And they fought under the banner, Freedom for Slaves. And this was extremely provocative for Virginia's slave owners. Well, after a couple of battles, one which he won, one which he lost, Lord Dunmore was thrown out of Virginia, and he went to New York with all of his forces. And the Ethiopian Regiment was demobilized. But Henry Washington went on to join another all-black unit called the Black Pioneers. Well, as the war proceeded, the British commander-in-chief in North America, Sir Henry Clinton, broadened out Lord Dunmore's proclamation and said, any slave who comes into British lines will automatically be emancipated. And so now you didn't have hundreds of slaves fleeing their plantations. You had thousands and tens of thousands. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that over 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom in the British lines. This was 20% of the entire slave population of the colonies. Now, why, might you say, did the British do this? Well, they did it exactly for the same reason that Abraham Lincoln was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 7 years later. They did it for military reasons. They wanted to cripple the plantation economy of the rebels, and they also wanted to divert manpower that the rebels would be using against British troops. They wanted them to be protecting their slave assets from running away.
Well, certainly that's one of the biggest concerns that had happened, and even Washington tried to go ahead and entice slaves to join the American cause. But there's another story of Washington having a slave running away on him, but not so much his slave as it was more Martha's slave. And are you familiar with that particular story?
I am, and her name was Uni Judge, and she was a personal maid of Martha Washington's. And when the Washingtons were in Philadelphia, when it was the capital, Martha said to one of her relatives who was being married, I am going to make you a present of my personal maid. Well, Uni Judge was having none of this. She didn't like this idea. So she hopped a ship to New Hampshire and fled to New Hampshire. Well, Washington didn't like this very much, and he tried to get various people in New Hampshire to send her back or to send her to Alexandria.
Well, not quite.
And they wrote a letter and said, we don't think you better do this because there's a lot of anti-slavery sentiment here, and it's going to cause a lot of embarrassment to you. So Washington kind of backed off.
Well, that's not quite how I hear the story, because from what I've heard the story is that Washington actually could have cared less about her running away. In fact, he was kind of like, well, all right, so she ran away. It's not like we don't have any other slaves back in Mount Vernon we can't bring up. It was actually Martha who demanded her back rather than the general. And so, as Professor Peter Henriquez was very fond of saying, Washington understood that it was far better to have a happy wife than it was to have a mad wife. And so he decided, okay, I will make a token effort of trying to get her back. Didn't work out so well, especially since he said, well, I'd rather not go ahead and have my personal honor destroyed. But at the same time, he didn't have a problem because, and this is one of the facts that is always interesting, a little bit of hidden history for Pennsylvania. If a slave came to Pennsylvania and was there for 6 months, as soon as the 6th month terminated, they were free.
Well, you see, this is where you always have a problem with Washington, because you always have a group of people who are going to defend his reputation no matter what. And whether Martha instigated it or whether it was George's idea, George was doing the letter writing. And there was also a nephew of George's who subsequently went to New Hampshire and tried to persuade Uni to come back, and she refused. Under the law, she was a fugitive slave until her death. And it was only the fact that New Hampshire was so violently anti-slavery that kept her from being returned by the friends of Washington. Let's face it, powerful men have powerful friends who want to please them.